So it seems like there's a need to clarify our understandings of anti-Semitism, and for two really quite different reasons at the moment. On the one hand, there has been a rise of anti-Semitism in the last generation. It seems to be tracked back to the 1990s and the growth of a kind of conservative online activism, the alt-right white nationalist movement that has grown from strength to strength in the online community, but has also spilled over into the rest of the world. And certainly in the United States, we've seen things happen recently, like the 2018 attack on the Tree of Life synagogue, in which 11 Jewish people were killed. The year after that, in 2019, at the Unite the Right riots in Charlottesville in the USA, we saw these groups of white nationalists chanting, "Jews will not replace us." And they actually killed someone during those white supremacist riots. At the same time, there's something completely different going on, which is a growing misuse of a false allegation of anti-Semitism, which is being used specifically to achieve very particular political goals. And in fact, it's being used to advance other forms of racism, particularly Islamophobic racism. And in the worst cases, it's being used to provide a kind of a cover for violent acts of ethnic cleansing and genocide. What's interesting about this version of the allegation of anti-Semitism is that it's used fairly often against Jewish people, and that there's a strong political move and a move by governments, by universities, by private companies to establish a working definition of anti-Semitism and a set of guidelines for dealing with it. So when we think about that, immediately we can ask the question, well, do we need a separate definition of anti-Semitism from our general understandings of racism? Do we need something specific? Isn't it enough just to have a general understanding of the conceptual tools of anti-racist analysis and our legal tools for acting against racism? And an argument can be made that there's a need to understand the specificity of all different forms of racism. They have different histories, they have different contemporary politics. And so I think there is a space for thinking about anti-Semitism, particularly in this conflicted political moment. Luckily, there are two widely available definitions of anti-Semitism that have been worked on recently. The first is the Jerusalem Declaration, and the other is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. And what's interesting about these two definitions is that there's a certain amount of tension between them. The first one that was advanced was the IHRA definition. And then the Jerusalem Declaration was, in some sense, proposed to deal with some of the problems and shortcomings in the IHRA definition. So if we look at the Jerusalem Declaration, which is a declaration put together by a very large body of academics working in Jewish studies, Middle Eastern studies, Holocaust studies, a real gathering of top expertise in these areas. They say we seek to provide a usable, concise, and historically informed core definition of anti-Semitism with a set of guidelines. They also comment on the IHRA definition, which had been developed just before this, saying that it's unclear in its key concepts and widely open to different interpretation. It has caused confusion and controversy and has weakened the fight against anti-Semitism. So they're trying to develop something better than the IHRA definition. But in their core of their claims, they say this: anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews or Jewish institutions as Jewish. Okay, so we've got this idea of discrimination, prejudice, hostility, violence against Jewish people or Jewish institutions. Now, of course, some of you will immediately see that within general kind of studies, critical studies of racism, there tend to be two different poles of thought. The one is a definition of racism as a kind of an attitude, as an individual practice, and the other is an understanding of racism as a kind of social phenomena, as a structural element of the way in which a society is organized. And I'm not going to go into those debates today, but you might just want to keep them in the back of your mind, the tension between racism as uh, sort of emanating from the from the beliefs, prejudice of an individual versus a way of organizing a society. And both of these definitions seem to pull a lot more towards the former. Okay, but let's look at what the Jerusalem Declaration has to say. They locate themselves within the historical tradition of anti-racist studies, saying it is racist to essentialize or to make sweeping negative generalizations about a given population. That's a fairly traditional, robust definition of racism. Um, uh, and then they say what is true of racism in general is true of anti-Semitism. So, okay, so anti-Semitism is these sweeping negative generalizations. Okay. And then they go on to specify what those sweeping generalizations might be. And the first thing is they argue the idea is that Jews are evil. Okay, and the way in which in historically in Western society this has been linked to certain kinds of conspiracy theories, theories of blood libel, and it exists today in various theories of Jewish people being linked to forms of social control and forms of social evil. But these have a long tradition and have long been used to mobilize violence against Jewish people. They further say that the anti-Semitism can be in the form of words and ideas, or it can be in the form of deeds, like physical acts of discrimination and violence. But one of the things that the Jerusalem Declaration is very sensitive to is the need for context. They say you can't just look at a particular statement or particular act in isolation and determine whether it's intrinsically anti-Semitic or not. It needs to be put in context. And in looking at this, they look at the way in which certain kinds of words or deeds are coded, that they don't say what they're doing, but they can be understood as fitting in with certain traditions. So certain kinds of, say, cartoons that uh, giving people a certain kind of distorted appearance. Those can be coded forms of anti-Semitism because they are part of a historical tradition of that kind of anti-Semitism. Or certain accusations of Jewish people having certain kinds of social control of society towards certain malicious ends form part of a tradition which gives it meaning. Okay, and so we look at the broad context. One of the important things they identify there is the question of denying or minimizing the Holocaust. Given the Holocaust is such a fundamental symbol of the where anti-Semitism can go, the full extent of its genocidal violence. The move towards minimizing or denying the Holocaust is seen as part of the process of erasing historical anti-Semitism and is thus part of an anti-Semitic way of thinking. But what's interesting in the Jerusalem Declaration is that they also are interested in contemporary social context. And they are particularly interested in the way in which the talk of anti-Semitism is currently often contextualized in terms of conflict in the Middle East, in terms of Palestine and Israel. And so they then clustered two further groups looking at the question of Israel and Palestine. They cluster things which a group of things which may be anti-Semitic, and the emphasis is on the may. The emphasis is on you have to interpret each thing in its context. So something that may be anti-Semitic in the context of Israel-Palestine is applying the traditional symbols of anti-Semitism to the state of Israel. Another thing that may be relevant there is blaming all Jewish people for acts committed by the state of Israel, or assuming that all non-Israeli Jewish people are more loyal to the state of Israel than to their own countries of which they are citizens. Another thing they put forward in relation to Israel is the idea of denying the right of Jews in Israel to exist and flourish according to principles of equality. And this is interesting that they add on there principles of equality. It's very significant that is added on, because the principle of equality should then apply to both Jewish people and all other people to whom that context is relevant. They then contrast those kinds of statements with statements which they say that on the surface may not be anti-Semitic, okay, in the context of Israel-Palestine. So, for instance, they say quite clearly that supporting a Palestinian demand for justice, for human rights, for civil rights, that is not intrinsically anti-Semitic, nor is opposing Zionism as a form of nationalism. And that includes arguing for a single state solution, arguing for a two-state solution, arguing for all equality, for equality of all inhabitants of the region. And they include the phrase "from the river to the sea," precisely because it's a highly contested phrase that has been used both by Israeli nationalists and by Palestinian critics. Finally, they say that strong or contentious criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. And they specifically include a quote. They're saying, political speech does not have to be measured, proportional, tempered, or reasonable to be protected under Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights and other human rights instruments. So they're specifically saying criticism of Israel, of Israeli nationalism, this is not intrinsically anti-Semitic. And they really make a fairly strong point of that in the context that certain kinds of criticism of a particular formation of the state of Israel or Israeli nationalism may be anti-Semitic, but you need to look at it more closely. So what we see there is a linking of anti-Semitism to a kind of general understanding of racism, a linking of it to the historical context of the specific forms that European anti-Semitism has stated, and an attempt to think through the highly contested subject of Israel-Palestine, and to say, well, certain kinds of critique of Israel may be anti-Semitic, but critique of Israel, even very strong, even very focused, even very contentious criticism of Israel, cannot be assumed in and of itself to be anti-Semitic. Now that's really important, because what they're doing is they're trying to correct what they see as some fairly serious flaws in a preceding definition of anti-Semitism, which is the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, a definition which had been developed a few years earlier. And this was developed more by kind of political, kind of nationalist interest groups rather than a broad consensus of academics. And so we see from the outset that it's a weaker definition, it's a less logically coherent definition, and is very problematic in certain ways. But there are also a lot of similarities. And the IHRA definition asserts anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and their property, towards a Jewish community, institution, and religious facilities. Now, once again, this is the kind of very individualist, very psychological view of racism, that anti-Semitism is a perception of Jews, rather than the more structural, more sociological view of racism as something that is structured into a society. So just to note that. What's interesting then is that they provide 11 different examples, most of which they specifically relate to the state of Israel. And this is one of the areas that the Jerusalem Declaration is trying to clarify. So the four general assertions are killing or inciting the killing of Jews. So violence or the incitement of violence against Jewish people. That's obvious, egregious anti-Semitism. Linked to that is once again this idea of denying the Holocaust, denying that Jewish people have been subject to some of the worst, most horrific forms of socially organized violence and brutality, to the point of genocide. Okay. They then also specify that blaming all Jews for acts of individual Jews is anti-Semitic. So, and that goes, very similar to the Jerusalem Declaration, is attributing something to an entire group of people. Similarly, demonizing Jews as a collective, and this is what we see done in this kind of the alt-right online community through the reemergence of conspiracy theories about media, economy, social control. They then move on to the bulk of the examples, which are linked to the state of Israel. So they say anti-Semitism exists in accusing Jews or Israel of exaggerating the Holocaust. Okay. And that's a kind of a complicated claim, because obviously Holocaust denialism is hugely problematic and on the face of it would seem to be anti-Semitic. But there's also another problem that needs to be thought through, which is the question of exceptionalizing the Holocaust, of giving the Holocaust a kind of a status of being unlike any other kind of human violence. And what this does is it erases the long history of ethnic cleansing and genocides that took place within Western colonialism. So on the one hand, we definitely do not want to be engaged in Holocaust denialism. We definitely don't want to be engaged in minimizing the extent of the Holocaust. But we also need to leave open space for talking about the fact that there is a relation between the forms of genocide, forms of ethnic cleansing in the Holocaust, and those that had been practiced on indigenous people by Western society. They further then say, using the symbols and images of classical anti-Semitism to characterize Israel or Israelis. And that seems to be fairly straightforward and in keeping with the kind of general Jerusalem Declaration attention to a kind of a tradition of negative symbolization and imagery that constitute contemporary anti-Semitism. They also bring up this question of accusing Jews of being more loyal to Israel than their own nation. Now, once again, we've got a bit of a problem there, and that is much better clarified in the Jerusalem Declaration, because of course there may be Jewish people who are more loyal to Israel than to their own nation. I mean, we've certainly seen that in U.S. politics in the last year or two. So simply making saying that a particular Jewish person is more loyal to Israel than to the country of which they hold citizenship, that would seem an impossible claim to sustain. Of course, if it was a generalized claim saying all Jewish people are by definition and intrinsically more loyal to Israel than to their own countries, then that claim would simply be preposterous and demonstrably empirically falsifiable. Um, then it becomes even more controversial. The IHRA definition asserts that there's anti-Semitism in denying the Jewish right to self-determination, and that's not problematic. It's where they say, for example, and I quote, by claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. And the problem with that is that, well, it seems on all evidence the existence of the State of Israel is a racist endeavor, and it has been identified as that by most of the human rights players, both in Israel and internationally. In Israeli NGOs like Yesh Din, B'Tselem have clearly identified the state of Israel as an apartheid state, as a racist endeavor. So have Human Rights Watch. So have Amnesty International. The International Court of Justice has found that the occupation of the Palestinian territories is in direct contravention of Article 3 of the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And in fact, the founder of the original apartheid state, where the word apartheid comes from, South Africa, the person who developed the blueprint of apartheid and was the founder leader of that state, Hendrik Verwoerd, is notoriously said Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state. So the idea that Israel is an apartheid state is not really controversial, and there's a high degree of consensus about it. And it seems that by saying that claiming the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor, to claim that that is anti-Semitic is to claim that most of the human rights organizations in Israel and internationally, and the international legal instruments that we have, are anti-Semitic. It's an outrageous claim, and it's a strongly counterfactual claim. And this really draws attention to not just a weakness in the IHRA definition, but it's something much more problematic than that. Okay, the other thing the IHRA definition claims is that drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policies to that of the Nazis, and this kind of extending the idea of that it is anti-Semitic to accuse Israel of racism. But it's common practice in social analysis, in analyzing authoritarian states, racist states, militarized states, imperialist states, to compare them to the example of the Nazis. The Nazis function as this kind of symbol of a certain extremity, of certain violent forms of Western governance. And it's not unusual to make comparisons between abuses of power in states and the example of the Nazis. So it's not clear why there should be an Israeli exceptionalism around this, that there shouldn't be a legitimate basis for using comparisons, doing a kind of contrast and compare studies, and indicating that where there may be structural similarities. The final thing that in the IHRA definition, which is also kind of interesting and problematic, they say that holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the state of Israel seems to be anti-Semitic, and it certainly does seem to be anti-Semitic. It's generalizing a particular quality of Jews. But what's interesting about that is that this kind of conflation of Jewishness and the state of Israel is exactly what the IHRA definition itself does. The IHRA definition it seems to be really committed to conflating Judaism with the state of Israel. And in doing that, it seems to be guilty of what it's accusing other people of. It seems to be collectively linking Jewish people to the state of Israel. And what this does is it erases anti-Zionist Judaism. And in that sense, it is anti-Semitic. It is anti-Semitic towards anti-Zionist Jewish people. It is anti-Semitic to people whose interpretation of Judaism, whose social values, um, put them in tension with the political policies and acts of the state of Israel. So in that sense, the IHRA definition is not simply kind of problematic. It doesn't simply illegitimately try and exceptionalize Israel as a state kind of outside the realm of ordinary criticism. It actually functions anti-Semitically against Jewish people who do not identify with the methods and practices of the existing political state of Israel. Um, Now, the reason this is all worth talking about is that there's something very strange been going on and continuing to go on. Is that although the Jerusalem Declaration is very clearly the superior, better thought through, more coherent, better articulated definition of anti-Semitism, the IHRA definition is being advanced with a lot of political pressure. There's been a huge political pressure to get adopted by states, by universities, by other organizations. And there's been no equivalent pressure to have the Jerusalem Declaration considered. Not only that, but in practice, the effect of getting the IHRA definition adopted by organizations has not been to effectively counter anti-Semitism. It has been, in practice, what it's been used for, particularly recently, is it has been weaponized to act against those who are advocating for the human rights of Palestinians. Okay, and this is specifically because the fundamental problem with the IHRA definition is its conflation of criticism with Israel with anti-Semitism. It seems completely unable to conceptually separate those things out. And what this means is that although it's not in the words of the definition, in the application of the IHRA definition, it has become functionally racist. And it's racist specifically in this being mobilized socially and politically to deny the human rights of Palestinians and other Middle Eastern people, as well as to permit racism against anti-Zionist Jewish people, denying them both their civil rights and their legitimate identity as Jewish people, as real Jews, while holding their anti-Zionist position. Now, that may or may not have been in the minds of the drafters of the IHRA definition. They may or may not have intended it to have those effects. But I think that's an uninteresting question. The question is, what effects is it having? And so it becomes very clear that the IHRA definition is not only a good example of articulating anti-racist understanding, specifically with respect to anti-Semitism. What it becomes is an instance of racism, an instance of Islamophobic racism, an instance of anti-Semitic racism. And it thus becomes really questionable why there is this pressure to adopt that very weak IHRA definition when there is the very robust Jerusalem Declaration available to us. But in looking at all of this, a couple of key themes emerge just that are useful in holding it all together. Firstly, we can't understand anti-Semitism separately from context. It's not just a particular thing that can be defined separate from history, culture, politics. Okay, we need to understand the history of European anti-Semitism. We need to understand how it culminated in the Holocaust. We need to understand the almost unimaginable gravity of the violence of the Holocaust. We also need to understand the emergence of a kind of a new alt-right white supremacism that is becoming more and more politically acceptable in certain countries, particularly in certain Western countries. And the strange way in which that kind of white supremacism is actually often pro-Zionist while it is anti-Semitic. We also need to pay very close attention to the conflict over Israel-Palestine and the way in which meanings and definitions can be weaponized, and the way in which the charge of anti-Semitism has very specifically, very actively been weaponized to shield the state of Israel from legitimate criticism and to shield it from being sanctioned for its breach of the human rights of Palestinian people and its responsibility for violence in the region. At the same time, we need to think of the broad European history of other forms of racism, particularly in their links to colonialism, their links to slavery, the global dispossession of indigenous people, and the ethnic cleansing and colonial genocides that were intrinsic to Western colonialism. At the same time, there's a more recent racist history of the rise of Western Islamophobia and neocolonialism in the Middle East. Going back to the early 20th century, the illegal wars, the criminal overthrow of Middle Eastern governments by Western powers in their desire to control the resources in the region, including most recently the killing of over 1 million people through a illegal Western war and crimes against humanity in Iraq and other countries in the region. And in paying attention to that, it also helps us understand some of the interpretative conflicts about Israel and about the colonial nature of the state of Israel and the continuation of its breaches of international human rights, its apartheid structure, its violence against Palestinian people and people in surrounding countries as being linked to that tradition, that long colonial tradition, and the recent neo-colonial traditions within the Middle East. And so we can see that what we are looking at is really a very problematic weaponization of the claim of anti-Semitism in relation to the conflict over Palestine. And this is precisely why we need to be much more thoughtful, much more clear, much more contextually informed in our understandings of racism in general and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in particular, but also to the emergent forms of white supremacism and their traditions located within Western colonialism, how there's been a shift from the kind of the global domination of Western colonialism through to these emergent new alt-right forms of white supremacism. So, in conclusion, we need to avoid definitions of one type of racism that allow another type of racism to occur, or even encourage another type of racism to occur. And this is why in this case, the Jerusalem Declaration is a far more effective starting point than the very limited and extremely politically biased IHRA definition, which has in fact, in recent history, been misused to shield the state of Israel from legitimate criticism. And this becomes an example of the way in which the creation of different accounts, of different interpretations, actually achieve goals, and often unintended goals. Because certainly most of the organizations, whether they're universities, whether they're states that have adopted the IHRA definition, have done so in good faith. That the adoption may have been driven from the outside by cynical political actors, but the people who have ratified those have done so in good faith out of a genuine concern for the real and growing problem of anti-Semitism. But because it has not been sufficiently thought through and hasn't had the depth of insight of the Jerusalem Declaration, it's in fact functioned practically, it functions structurally to to allow and to protect other forms of very, very serious, very, very violent racism from being subject to criticism and intervention in ways that are really essential if we are serious about human rights.